My name is Aslı Bali. I'm the director of the UCLA Center for Near Eastern Studies. Welcome to the second Averroes Lecture, which has been made possible by a generous private donation to the center. Our center is a hub for academic research, scholarly collaboration, and support for undergraduate and graduate language study of the critical languages of the Middle East. We also serve as a resource to the UCLA campus and the broader public in bringing essential programming about the Middle East to our campus through public lectures, workshops, symposia, and conferences. This year, the Center for Near Eastern Studies is celebrating its 60th anniversary as an interdisciplinary research center on the Middle East, fostering collaborative scholarship at UCLA while also bringing leading scholars from around the country and the world to our campus. The Averroes Lecture Series, which is designed to excavate histories of intercommunal life and highlight the pluralism of the Middle Eastern societies, is a valuable investment. These lectures enrich our intellectual life on campus and fulfill important aspects of our core mission as both a public and a global university. The series is named after Averroes, the Latin name of Ibn Rushd, the 12th century Andalusian Muslim polymath whose philosophical works integrated Islamic traditions with ancient Greek thought. Over subsequent centuries, his commentaries on Plato and Aristotle influenced Jewish and Christian thinkers throughout Europe, among them Maimonides, Aquinas, and Spinoza. The announcement of the Averroes Lecture Series has generated intellectual excitement on our campus and has already fostered new ties between faculty working on Ottoman history, Islamic studies, Jewish studies, the study of religion, and the broader history of the Middle East and North Africa in several disciplines across the campus. We are particularly grateful to the series co-sponsors, the Alan D. Levy Center for Jewish Studies and the Center for the Study of Religion. The multi-ethnic, multi-confessional identity of the Middle East is often obscured when we think of the Middle East in terms of ancient ethnic hatreds. In truth, the region is historically characterized as much by ancient ethnic bonds and ties across religions, across tribes, and across ethnicities. By revisiting the histories of Jewish-Muslim relations, we hope to teach our students and remind ourselves of the resonance between the intellectual dialogue and communal exchange that took place across Muslim lands of the past and our own mission as a university serving a diverse student population in the present. Each lecture will feature a distinguished scholar of Middle East studies who will speak on a facet of Jewish life in the Muslim world from the Middle Ages through the early 20th century. These presentations are being published in an occasional paper series devoted to the Averroes Lectures, and we plan to convene a major conference at the end of the lecture series featuring young scholars engaged in cutting-edge research in the field. Tonight, I am delighted to welcome our second Averroes lecturer, Professor Eve Krakowski of Princeton University's Department of Near Eastern Studies. Professor Kowski, who studies Judaic studies, is an expert in the social history of the medieval Middle East, mainly through documents preserved in the Cairo Geniza. She's a specialist on gender, kinship, and rabbinic legal practice among Jews in Fatimid and Ayyubid, Egypt. She is currently completing a 2-year American Council of Learned Societies collaborative fellowship on documents and institutions in the medieval Middle East. Her first book is tentatively titled Coming of Age in Medieval Egypt, Young Women and Society Among the Jews of the Cairo Geniza, and is forthcoming from the Princeton University Press. Her talk today, as you will see, is titled Beyond Honor and Shame, Rabbinic Control of Jewish Women in Medieval Egypt. Please join me in welcoming Professor Krakowski.
This is a Jewish contract from the Fayum from 1008. Which describes an agreement between a husband and a wife after a fight. She appeared before us and said, I have sinned, make peace between us. She wept, she and her son, before the Jews, and they pressured Abraham, her husband, and said to him, why will you not accept her? He said to them, she has shamed me and the people of my household, my brother and sister, and their children. We asked about these words and found them to be true. We obligated her towards her husband that she will stand before him when he enters and leaves, serve and honor him, that as long as she is pure, she won't refrain from the household's needs. When she sees him distressed, she won't answer back to his words. If she needs clothing or important garments, she won't ask him for them unless he can afford them. She won't shame him with evil, disgraceful, or scornful words, nor his relatives, not mention him or his relatives except according to their honor, not defy him with improper words or deeds, not go out without his permission, not ask him to go to Fustat or anywhere else without his permission, honor and value and serve him, not sit idly in his house, refusing to perform any work in flax and wool or any of the needs of her house, refusing to make dough or cook. Anytime she rebels and defies any of these conditions, he will be exempt from her, and she will go out from him with a bill of divorce. This is one of about 30,000 everyday papers, including letters, court records and communal and state administrative documents written by Jews in 10th to 13th century Egypt and Syria under the Fatimid and Ayyubid empires, and preserved by chance in a synagogue in Fustat, Old Cairo. This corpus, commonly termed the Cairo Geniza, preserves some of the richest, densest, most intimate, and most varied evidence we have for pre-modern life in the Islamic Middle East and indeed the pre-modern world in general, including evidence for the everyday practice of Jewish law in this Islamic milieu, through thousands of legal documents, like the one I just showed you, that offer a granular picture of how rabbinic courts in Fustat and other cities worked, how they translated the vast system of Jewish laws that we know from prescriptive rabbinic literature into everyday legal behaviors on the ground, and how these legal behaviors affected and were affected by these Jews' ordinary social and cultural norms and ideas. Today I'm going to focus on one such site of interaction between legal and ordinary norms, reflected in one line of this fascinating document. The wife's promise that she will not go out, that is, leave her house or perhaps even her living chamber, without her husband's permission. Female seclusion and its counterpart veiling in public spaces are practices of very longue durée in the Middle East. Perhaps the best known explanatory framework for understanding these practices is an anthropological approach dating back to the 1960s that views controls on women's bodies as essential to a pan-Mediterranean as well as pan-Middle Eastern cultural system of honor and shame, in which men's social honor depends on the sexual chastity of their female relatives, as expressed here in a famous 1966 volume devoted to Mediterranean honor and shame. The quality required of women in relation to honor is shame, particularly sexual shame. A woman protects her honor most effectively by conforming in every outward aspect of her deportment to a code of sexual shame, and its loss always implicates the honor of the men of the family. More recently, scholars including Sabah Mahmoud and, in the context of Roman late antiquity, Kate Wilkinson, have cast seclusion and veiling as performative cultural practices, often reproduced by women themselves. This approach does not necessarily preclude a cultural emphasis on sexualized honor and shame, as in the older anthropological model, but it emphasizes secluded and veiled women's agency rather than their oppression. But few scholars have examined the social history of seclusion among ordinary women in the medieval Middle East, where a rich body of evidence exists that might help both qualify and enrich the honor and shame model and bring it into conversation with this recent scholarship on performative modesty. In this talk, I'm going to take a first step in this direction by examining 3 different contexts in which Geniza Jews, which I'm going to just use as shorthand for the Jews who produced the documents in this corpus, restricted women's physical mobility. In each case, these restrictions were mediated or accommodated partly through the rabbinic courts, in ways that illustrate not just ideas about women's seclusion, but also how normative religious law worked among these medieval Islamicate Jews, as well as the law's limits. At the end of the talk, I'll come back to the question of honor and shame and to the contract that we just looked at, and suggest that these 3 cases that I'm going to discuss can plausibly be located within a gendered cultural system of honor and shame, but that this system, as reflected in the Geniza, looks quite different from the one described in this quote and the scholarship that it reflects. First, I'd like to just give you some brief background on the rabbinic courts and on women's living spaces among Geniza Jews. Beginning at least in the 11th century, right around the time the document that I started with was written, Jews in cities and towns throughout Fatimid and Ayyubid Egypt and Syria maintained their own communal courts of law that oversaw, ratified, and recorded transactions, agreements, and arguments among Jews, so not those that Jews had with Muslims or Christians. These included sales, gifts, loans, commercial contracts and disputes surrounding marriage, divorce, and inheritance. These rabbinic courts operated with tacit and sometimes explicit state recognition, but within an open legal arena in which Jews could and did also appear before Islamic religious judges, qadis, or submit petitions called mathalim directly to state officials. And they exercised weaker coercive power than either Islamic judges or state officials because Jewish courts couldn't physically punish litigants except by handing them over to the state or by excommunicating them, a social ban that was really impossible to affect fully in practice and that was therefore rarely used. Despite these limits, these courts remained robust and well-patronized institutions throughout the centuries that the Geniza documents. I argue in my forthcoming book, Coming of Age in Medieval Egypt, that this was partly because rabbinic law bore meaning as a category, a recognized category of religious law within the broader Islamicate social order of the Fatimid and Ayyubid empires, meaning that Jews and Muslims alike expected rabbinic Jews to follow rabbinic law as administered by these courts. But this assumption also rested on a particular conception of law as what I call a system of technical legal norms that in practice permitted considerable social flexibility. So almost all Geniza documents are crafted as self-consciously valid rabbinic legal instruments at the level of their formulae and clauses and the way in which their content is framed. But their content itself, meaning the actual conditions and agreements that they ratify between people, is often not solely or even especially rabbinic at all, but rather reflects these Islamicate Jews' ordinary ideas and values. Moreover, there's quite a lot of evidence that in practice, litigants' social status and personal networks heavily influenced their legal outcomes in these courts, no matter what rights rabbinic law offered weaker litigants on paper. So that's the courts. As for housing, most of our evidence comes from the city of Fustat, where most middling and lower class people, including Jews, lived in multi-story courtyard buildings termed dars, which, like apartment buildings now, were often divided into different sections in which disconnected groups of people lived, including people who weren't related to each other and even including Jews, Muslims, and Christians in a single building. This is a tentative reconstruction based on excavations in Fustat of what the first story of an especially lavish building of this kind might have looked like. And this is one of a much smaller dwelling of the poor, based on what the archaeologists guessed was probably a poorer section inhabited by lower class people. Unfortunately, most of the evidence for women's seclusion that I'm going to present doesn't make clear whether secluded women moved freely within a dar, either like this one or like this one, or whether they were confined to their personal living chambers. So that's the background, and now I'm going to start with case number 1. The first context in which mobility restrictions show up in the Geniza is a small group of marriage contracts and reconciliation agreements like the ones I started with, which were drawn up by couples on the verge of divorce, that address the husband's control over when his wife will go out or where she'll go when she does so. Some of these clauses grant the husband control over his wife's movements, as in the case I showed you at the beginning, whereas others deny him such control. Right, so this one gives him control and this one denies him. He will not lock the door upon her nor prevent her from visiting her family. A few of these clauses date to the 11th century, but most come from the 12th century, when Geniza marriage agreements began to routinely feature a range of personalized stipulations regulating both spouses' rights and responsibilities in marriage. Some of these clauses are standardized promises. So the husband pledges in some of them to consider his wife financially trustworthy in all matters of food and drink, which means that his heirs wouldn't force her to swear an oath about how she'd used his property after his death, that he won't marry another wife or own a female slave, sometimes explicitly called a concubine, without her permission, and that he'll return half of her dowry to her relatives if she dies childless. These are relatively fixed when they appear. Others of these clauses are more fluid. They include residence clauses about where the wife will live, either in a specific city or with her own relatives or her husband's. Travel clauses about whether the husband can leave home for long stretches of time. Economic agency clauses about whether the wife or husband will control her labor or her dowry. And finally, mobility clauses granting him various degrees of control over her movements outside the home. As a group, these clauses seem to have their origins in Islamic scribal practice, but they appear in Geniza marriage contracts in recognizably Judaized forms, meaning that both their function and content were formulated in conversation with normative rabbinic law. So what ideas about women's mobility do these clauses reflect, and what were they supposed to accomplish? I'm going to address these questions backwards. First, what were they supposed to achieve? If, as I've suggested, rabbinic courts couldn't directly punish spouses who violated these agreements, what practical value did they hold? Why did people bother to come to court to commission them? Very few Geniza documents directly answer this question, because very few of these documents describe any of these clauses' immediate afterlives. But both the contracts themselves and other texts from this period embed these stipulations in a characteristically rabbinic economic framework of marriage and divorce that indirectly explains how they were supposed to work. This rabbinic model is most explicit not within the mobility clauses that are my concern here, but in polygamy clauses, which typically state that if the husband breaks his promise and marries a second wife or keeps a slave concubine, he'll have to pay his wife's deferred portion and divorce her, even if it is she who wishes to separate, is added in some contracts. So what does this stipulation mean? Rabbinic divorce is a unilateral male privilege. A husband can divorce or refuse to divorce his wife at will, and she has no say in the matter. But this unilateral right is tempered by the husband's dower. In classical rabbinic idiom, the ketubah, a cash payment that he or his estate has to make if he dies or divorces her. Sorry, he has to make to her. So meaning if he divorces her without her consent, or even with her consent, ends the marriage, he has to pay her this cash amount. There are two exceptions to this basic framework, though. First, a moredet, a rebellious wife who refuses to perform certain tasks, such as have sex with her husband, forfeits her dower and can be divorced freely without this cash payment. On the other hand, a husband who refuses to support his wife or denies her certain freedoms loses his unilateral divorce rights and theoretically must divorce her and pay her dower. Yotzivi ten ketubah. Rabbinic jurists in the medieval Middle East understood this model to create what was essentially a bilateral system of divorce centered on the husband's dower. So a wife could choose to rebel specifically in order to forfeit her dower and get a divorce, but she could also sue for divorce without forfeiting her dower if she could claim that her husband had mistreated her and was therefore subject to the second of these exceptions, to Yotzivi ten ketubah. So this is the normative legal background to our polygamy formula. It plugs the stipulation against polygamy into this economic model by stating that if a husband breaks this promise and marries another wife or takes a concubine, he becomes subject to the second of these exceptions, to Yotzivi ten ketubah. So he has to pay his wife's dower and divorce her even if he doesn't want to. The same framework implicitly applied to other marriage stipulations, including mobility ones. They were supposed to work by giving one or the other spouse greater bargaining power in divorce negotiations over the dower. So a wife might sue her husband for divorce and her dower if he'd promised to allow her freedom of movement but then tried to lock her in the house. And conversely, if a wife had promised to give her husband control over her movements but then disobeyed and went out without his permission, he could divorce her and claim that he didn't owe her a dower at all. This is what the opening contract that we looked at means when it says in this paragraph below, anytime she rebels and defies any of these conditions, he will be exempt from her, meaning from having to pay her dower, and she will go out from him with a bill of divorce. So that's these clauses' function. They were supposed to work by encoding private agreements between a couple into the economic framework of rabbinic divorce law, something that was within the court's purview despite their limited powers of enforcement, simply because Jewish litigants and Islamic officials alike viewed them as legitimate producers of Jewish marriage and divorce contracts. Although in practice, there's a lot of evidence that rabbinic court documents like this were generally subject to constant renegotiations when disputes about their content arose, and that very few divorcing women ended up receiving the whole dower they'd been promised at marriage, no matter how they'd behaved as wives. Nonetheless, this is the theory. So what about these clauses' contents? Here, too, these stipulations reference rabbinic norms. In the case of mobility clauses, their assumption that a husband can or should control his wife's public mobility parallels late ancient rabbinic texts. For example, a passage in the Tosefta, likely compiled in 3rd century Palestine, outlines a hierarchy of degrees of restriction. Okay, so this is an early late ancient rabbinic text. As there are opinions regarding food, so regarding women. One man, when a fly enters his cup, throws his drink away without drinking it. This is like Papus ben Yehuda, who locked the door against his wife and left. Another, when a fly falls into his drink, throws the fly away and drinks. This is, thank you very much. My slides ran away. Another, when a fly falls into his drink, throws the fly away and drinks. This is the measure of any man who sees his wife speaking with her neighbors or her relatives and permits her. Another, when a fly falls into his plate, takes it, sucks it, throws it out, and eats the plate's contents. This is the measure of an evil man who sees his wife going out bareheaded with her shoulders exposed, spinning in the marketplace, washing and sporting with every man. It is a good deed to divorce her. This rabbinic passage describes three types of husbands. One tries to seclude his wife entirely. The second allows her basic social contact with her neighbors and relatives. And the third allows her complete freedom of movement. Ishai Rosenzweig has suggested that this and related texts reflect an internal rabbinic debate in late antiquity between two models of patriarchal control. One model, which is fulfilled by the first husband here, promotes physical control of women as a value in and of itself. He locked the door against her and left. The other model requires a husband to limit his wife's behavior directly and only in order to ensure her sexual chastity. This model is represented in negative terms by the third husband here, who fails to keep his wife out of the marketplace and thus allows her to sport with every man. And the same model is represented positively by the second husband, who limits his wife's movements in order to prevent this kind of sporting, but doesn't completely isolate her. He sees her speaking with her neighbors or her relatives and permits her. Geniza mobility clauses reflect both of these late ancient rabbinic models. For example, in a betrothal contract composed in 1127, a bride authorizes her husband to behave exactly like the first husband in that rabbinic passage, the archetype of overbearing rabbinic patriarchy. She promises him that she will come and go only by his will, and when he permits her to do so, whenever he wishes, he may lock her in, and she may make no claim against him, that is, she can't sue him for her dower because of this, over this at all. But this clause is unusual. Most Geniza agreements instead echo the intermediate, moderately patriarchal model preferred by rabbinic literature. For example, a marriage agreement from the early 12th century specifies that the husband will permit his wife to attend the synagogue, the bathhouse, places of celebration and mourning. He will allow her to leave the house in order to buy and sell flax, and to visit her sister whenever she wishes. All outings that the document describes as permitted to a proper Jewish woman of her type. Similar lists of licit venues for proper Jewish women appear elsewhere, including in some prescriptive medieval rabbinic texts. For example, the great 12th century jurist Maimonides programmatically states, "Every woman has the right to come and go to her father's house to visit him, and to houses of mourning and feasting, in order to behave kindly towards her friends and relatives, so that they'll come to visit her. For she is not in prison such that she may not come and go. But it is shameful for a woman to be constantly going out, and a husband should prevent his wife from doing this and permit her to go out only once or twice a month as needed." It's very unlikely that all Geniza wives ventured outside only for these reasons. I'll return to the once or twice a month bit a bit later. For example, poor women in Fustat during this period, including married ones, regularly attended public charity distributions where they mingled with men in open air while waiting in line outside the synagogue, a fact recorded without comment in Rabbinite communal officials' own charity lists. You can see the genders are mixed and some of these women are wives. Nonetheless, passages like this do seem to offer a meaningful, relatively widespread index of ideal wifely propriety among Geniza Jews, according to which husbands should control their wives' movements in public space, and wives should ideally leave the house only for particular reasons tied mainly to worship and sociability. So that's case number one. Case two. We get a different view of women's mobility from a cluster of Geniza documents and responsa, which are legal answers written in response to questions about particular legal cases, from the late 12th century, which describe a communal reform instigated by Maimonides, the author of this passage, and of both the greatest Jewish legal code of the Middle Ages, to which this passage belongs, as well as arguably the greatest Jewish philosophical text of the Middle Ages. Maimonides spent his adult life in Egypt and served briefly as Ra'is al-Yahud, head of the Jews in the Ayyubid Empire. first from 1171 to 1173, and again from 1198 to 1199. During the first of these tenures, in 1171, he famously passed a decree intended to compel women throughout Egypt to practice rabbinic menstrual purity laws. Texts about this event tell us intimate details about women's domestic lives that surface nowhere else in the Geniza. Here, too, a bit of rabbinic background is in order. Rabbinic law, as it had evolved by Maimonides' time and as he understood it, forbids menstruating women to have sex with their husbands or to touch them or to perform certain household tasks for them, making the husband's bed, mixing his wine, and so on. These restrictions last throughout a woman's period and for 7 days afterwards. At the end of this clean week, a woman is supposed to immerse herself in flowing water or in a ritual pool, a mikveh, that contains a certain amount of flowing water and can then resume having sex. However, Maimonides states that few Jewish women in 12th century Egypt followed this rabbinic protocol. Instead, they maintained a range of slightly different menstrual purity practices, some less restrictive and others far more restrictive. On the one hand, Maimonides says that while women did typically wash after menstruation, most of them did so immediately after rather than waiting the extra 7 days. And they immersed not in flowing water, but in the local bathhouse, which was filled with water that had been drawn, not from a naturally flowing source. It's actually not clear that there was a mikveh, a rabbinic ritual pool in Fustat in this period, so these women's choice may have been between going to the bathhouse, something that women did routinely in any case, or immersing themselves in the Nile or a spring, which would have been much more inconvenient, perhaps even dangerous, and as Maimonides points out elsewhere, also cold. On the other hand, Egyptian Jews weren't simply apathetic about menstrual purity. Most women and their husbands clearly believed that going to the bathhouse would purify them. Some practiced an alternate purification ritual there called sak, or pouring, in which a non-menstruating woman poured water over the post-menstrual woman, who was coming there to be purified. Maimonides vehemently opposed this pouring practice as heretical and a threat to rabbinic legal authority, and he sought to punish women for it even if they'd also immersed properly, which suggests that women themselves must have viewed this practice not as a substitute for the mikveh, but as a meaningful ritual process in its own right that they wanted to continue doing, even possibly in addition to rabbinic immersion. Other texts describe medieval Egyptian Jews as routinely restricting menstruating women far beyond the limited roster of tasks forbidden by rabbinic law, prohibiting them from touching others' food, clothing, and certain furnishings in the household, including woven mats and doorsteps. For example, the marriage agreement I opened the talk with, did these run away again? Okay, this is where we're supposed to be. For example, the marriage agreement I opened the talk with states that the wife won't refuse to perform any household duties as long as she is pure. A query submitted to Maimonides almost 200 years later says something similar in more detail. The women's custom among us and everywhere else that we know of is for a woman to distance herself from the time of her period or childbirth. She doesn't touch food or drink or clothes or other things until her period ends, and she purifies herself in the bathhouse or somewhere similar. So this isn't Maimonides speaking, it's the question that was sent to him. In contrast to the pouring ritual, which he opposed as anti-rabbinic, Maimonides treated these super restrictions on women as neutrally non-rabbinic and therefore viewed them as unnecessary but permissible. In fact, this query goes on to suggest that Maimonides himself was known to have maintained these stringencies in his own home. So again, I'll first discuss the function of Maimonides' decree and then the ideas about women's purity and mobility that these texts reflect. Maimonides' decree was intended to compel women to wait the 7 clean days and then immerse in rabbinically valid fashion by harnessing the same very limited source of pragmatic rabbinic power that animated Geniza marriage stipulations, the same rabbinic model of divorce and the dower that ties spouse's behavior in marriage to the wife's financial rights at divorce. To explain this briefly, Maimonides understood any woman who had sex with her husband without immersing properly to have committed a serious rabbinic transgression, which automatically nullified her rights to a dower. But many rabbinic crimes can't be punished unless a person's received a formal warning beforehand. His decree on immersion, which states that it was meant to be read aloud in synagogues throughout Egypt, was formally intended as such a warning. So the decree itself, after it had been read publicly, enabled, in normative rabbinic court terms, rabbinic courts to deny divorcing women their dower if they'd had sex with their husbands while rabbinically impure. Any Jewish woman who doesn't immerse in a mikveh and mikveh water after counting 7 clean days, or who pours, will go out without her dower. She will have no claim to her dower or to its conditions, meaning the stipulations that we talked about in our first case. This also applied to widows. No widow who appears in court to claim her dower will receive 1 penny until she's taken an oath demonstrating that she'd immersed. This decree had demonstrably oppressive results for women. Its social impact is clear from Geniza marriage contracts, which begin at this point to include stipulations about women's immersion, some of which are framed to reinforce Maimonides' warning, so they put the burden on women. She will count the 7 clean days after her menstruation and immerse at a valid site for ritual immersion, just as he does. And others that place responsibility for women's immersion on their husbands, which was, I believe, individual families' way of trying to lessen the economic threat this decree posed to their daughters. So, for example, this contract states he will not have sex with her until he's confirmed with her that she counted 7 clean days, probably something like from the time that her blood stopped, and immersed after that in a valid site for immersion. The nature of the economic threat that contracts like this may have been trying to avoid is clear from numerous legal queries sent to Maimonides and his son Avraham after him, describing husbands who clearly did not share his concern for rabbinic immersion, but who were now able to accuse their wives of menstrual impurity at the end of the marriage as a way to avoid paying them their dowers. This became a devastating maneuver for divorcing wives and even widows similarly accused by their husbands' heirs, because Maimonides placed the burden of proof in such cases squarely on the woman, in ways that ended up costing many women their dowers. This is likely the most socially interventionist action we know of any Jewish communal leader in medieval Egypt taking, whose results were deeply gendered and disruptive to women's lives. But beyond that, these texts also tell us some unexpected things about women's everyday movements. It's these super restrictions on women's cooking, laundry, and touching household items that are of greatest interest here. Scholars have linked these practices to restrictions known from late Roman Palestinian Jewish texts, but their genesis hasn't yet been firmly established, in my view, because we also have evidence for comparable practices among Jews in medieval Iraq and among the general population of Egypt, stretching all the way back to the Ptolemaic era. In any case, wherever they came from, they obviously reflect fear of menstrual contagion, the idea that a menstruating woman could transfer her ritual impurity to inanimate objects, which would then pollute other people who touched them. It seems very likely to me that among Jews who maintained these super restrictions, which apparently was most Jews in medieval Egypt, at least through Maimonides' day, a woman's distancing herself, as this text puts it, included menstrual seclusion, meaning it seems likely to me that a woman who practiced these restrictions would have stayed inside her household, perhaps even inside her living chamber, as long as she was menstruating. This assumption is partly speculative. On a practical level, I find it hard to believe that among a population that did practice varying levels of female seclusion, menstruating women who were this severely restricted within the household would have been permitted, or perhaps permitted themselves, to circulate in public space or enter other people's households. Moreover, women's seclusion during menstruation is attested among non-Jewish populations in Egypt and in Egyptian antiquity and late antiquity, where these local Jewish practices may have developed. But this suggestion is not entirely speculative either. Maimonides' writings also offer several indirect clues that this was indeed the case, and I'm going to just mention one. A responsum issued to a man from Baghdad, whom it describes, the query itself is lost, but the answer describes this man as having said something about that which they denounce us, that is Iraqi Jews, for, that we permit a woman to remain in her house during her 7 clean days. We don't know what this means with respect to medieval Iraqi Jewish practice, and apparently neither did Maimonides. But strangely, he also seems to not even have understood the question. So he responds by saying, I don't know what this means in your practice. And then he suggests 3 options for what this might mean, which turn out to be the same 3 options known to him from Jews in Egypt. Either, he suggests, Iraqi Jews maintain the same core rabbinic separations between a menstruating woman and her husband that he himself considers valid, so her touching her husband even with her pinky finger, or eating with him, or sharing his cup. Or, second option, the Egyptian super restrictions on a woman's handling of food, laundry, and cooking. Or, third option, he suggests maybe this means pouring and its associated practices. One plausible reading of this puzzling response, I think, is to assume that Maimonides understood all 3 of these sets of practices as involving a menstruating woman's seclusion. So much so that he took this aspect of menstrual practice for granted, and when it was mentioned to him, could only point to the entire range of practices that he knew of as possibly being described by this phrase. This is the same jurist, remember, who recommended that women leave their houses only once or twice a month. If so, it's all the more remarkable that Maimonides nonetheless placed the onus for proper immersion on women rather than their husbands. His decree assumes that a woman could choose whether or not to leave the house, likely, as I've suggested, after a period of menstrual seclusion, in order to travel to a body of water and immerse herself without her husband's direct involvement or even knowledge. Indeed, many of the divorce cases that followed his decree echo this assumption. They cite men who claimed, apparently plausibly, if not necessarily truthfully, that their wives had lied to them for years about their immersion practices. So this episode not only expands our sense of the patterns of women's seclusion, but also implies that women's mobility wasn't always, or perhaps even usually, controlled by their husbands as tightly as Geniza mobility clauses might suggest, and that many husbands may in fact have been largely unaware of their wives' daily movements. Which brings me to case number 3. Not all secluded women were kept indoors either by a husband's demands or by their menstrual status. An 11th century letter from Jerusalem eulogizes one of the most severely isolated women to appear in the Geniza, an old woman named Esther. The letter's writer, who was probably her relative, complains that he couldn't care for her properly during her illness because she refused to publicly expose herself in the slightest degree, even, and in this case it's clear, within the dar, the building in which she lived. I was unable to care for her as was needed because our master Barhun and his father were staying in the room adjacent to the room in which she lived. So just to remind you, we're talking about rooms used as separate apartments or living spaces within a building like this one. And so these were non-relatives, men who were not related to her, who lived adjacent to her within such a building. She was exceedingly modest, tsnua biyoter, that no noise be heard from her. But there was a small door between the rooms where she used to sit companionably with me, and I provided whatever she needed. She asked me to stop doing this out of concern for the men, that is, these non-relatives who lives next door to her, that they not hear a word from her. So this woman chose, against her male caretaker's wishes, to seclude herself auditorily as well as visually within her own living chamber, restraining even the sound of her voice from carrying over into semi-public space. What motivated women like this? Here again, prescriptive legal texts can help us, not because they advocate this degree of seclusion, but because they describe it as a recognized social practice that often had legal implications for court procedure. Both Jewish and Islamic legal texts composed in the medieval Middle East, beginning first in Abbasid and Buyid Iraq in the 8th to 11th centuries, mention a class of women who never appeared in public, a practice that required Jewish and Islamic courts to develop special protocols for communicating with them. Medieval Muslim jurists call these women secluded, or those who do not go out. Rabbinite Jewish texts term them modest, tsnu'ah, the same Hebrew word used here to describe this woman. A 10th century Gaon, head of a rabbinic scholastic academy in Baghdad, states that before summoning a woman to court, Jewish court officials in Iraq would first try to determine whether she belonged to this secluded class, whether she was accustomed to go out in order to conduct business, buy and sell, and speak with men, in which case they would summon her to court, or a tsnu'ah, a modest woman who dwells inside, in which case they would send court representatives to her. Abbasid-era Islamic sources describe this type of strict seclusion neither as a pious practice nor a sign of sexual chastity, but as a class indicator that signaled a woman's elite status. This link between seclusion and high social standing isn't unique to the Abbasid era, but in fact has an extremely longue durée history in the Middle East. Similar conceptions have been noted in studies stretching from ancient Mesopotamia to late Ottoman Istanbul and Cairo. Unsurprisingly, Geniza Jews seem also to have understood women's seclusion in these terms. An early 12th century court record from Fustat awarding a woman alimony while her husband is away on business notes that she will require provisions not only for herself, but also for her slave, the one who serves her, since she is among the elite of the city who remain secluded in their homes. Meaning, without this slave, she'd have no access to the outside world or way to procure food and water. Documents about young and teenage girls' movements further suggest that, as in Esther's case, the case of that old woman who didn't want her voice carrying into the next room, this form of complete seclusion was often maintained and encouraged by women themselves. These documents describe girls of all ages as circulating in public in similar ways to their own female relatives, and those that mention fully secluded girls describe them as kept indoors mainly by their mothers. For example, an undated Geniza letter sent by a dying woman to her sister asks her to take care of her young daughter after she has died, to educate the daughter, retain a female slave who'd been caring for her, and to keep her strictly secluded. Do not permit her to appear before anyone. Indeed, Maimonides takes it as a given that mothers are more anxious than fathers about their daughters' movements. In a responsum about a custody dispute, he states that a daughter whose parents are divorced should live with her mother, since it is not customary for a father to sit and guard his daughter. A girl's modesty, or it might even be possible to read this as seclusion, since again the word here is tsniut, depends on her remaining with her mother. I've discussed three contexts in which Geniza documents and related texts describe women's seclusion. First, marriage contracts about husband-enforced seclusion, which define how much mobility an individual wife may claim from her husband during marriage, and which mainly reflect an ideal of wifely propriety, in which husbands should permit their wives to go outside, but only for specific reasons, to go to the bathhouse, the synagogue, and to socialize with relatives. Two, texts about women's menstrual purity that I've argued suggest most Jewish women in Egypt may have stayed indoors while menstruating, but also that many men did not, in fact, closely monitor their wives' movements in practice. And three, texts that suggest some socially elite Geniza women practice a stricter form of seclusion, remaining indoors all or much of the time as a mark of high status. This material, unfortunately, is not specific enough to permit a detailed typology of Geniza women's everyday movements. For example, it doesn't make clear whether strictly secluded women refrained even from visiting the bathhouse, or whether they sometimes did go outside, but only at night, a modesty custom mentioned in early Islamic sources and at least one Jewish text. We also don't know how often any of these women went outside, so it's not at all clear what social reality Maimonides' recommendation that women should go out only once or twice a month reflects, or for how long they went outside when they did so, or what they wore. Maimonides also states elsewhere that Jewish women in some regions went outdoors only in a head-to-toe cloak, which seems plausible given what we know of Geniza women's clothing, but again, the specifics are not clear. Finally, our sources don't reveal precisely how extreme seclusion mapped onto social status among different populations, nor how any of these practices that I've described may have shifted over time and between regions, either within Egypt or throughout the broader medieval Islamic world, nor whether they fell along different axes for Jews and Muslims. Some of these questions may become more answerable as further work is done on Islamic literary and documentary sources pertaining to this issue. Others may not. In the meantime, I'm going to end by circling back to a different question. What cultural meanings did women's seclusion hold for Geniza Jews? What I hope I've made clear so far is that seclusion wasn't a monolithic practice, but held a range of different meanings for different women and the people around them, and even for any given woman in different contexts and at different times. Yet it's worth noting that several ideas about seclusion we might have expected to find among this medieval Middle Eastern population, and also Mediterranean population, are notably absent. First, as I've mentioned, Geniza documents never represent seclusion as a symptom of female piety. Second, they don't describe it as protecting public morality. We might have expected them to, because this idea is expressed in slightly later Islamic texts, which beginning in the 12th century and increasingly thereafter, represent women in public spaces as a dangerous source of fitna, sexual temptation, as Marianne Katz documents in the context of mosque attendance in an excellent recent book, Women in the Mosque. Even before this, historiographical works describe occasional cases in Egypt in which Fatimid and later state officials limited women's circulation for similar reasons, in order to keep the public order free of sexual temptation. But these episodes and the ideas about sexual temptation and public morality that they reflect have left few, if any, traces in the Geniza corpus. This is just not an ideology that shows up in this material. Finally, our evidence likewise does not conform to the classic anthropological model of sexualized Mediterranean honor and shame. That model, captured in this citation that I showed you near the start of the talk, makes two assumptions. First, that in Mediterranean cultures, women's honor has often depended on their sexual control and comportment. A woman protects her honor most effectively by conforming in every outward aspect of her deportment to a code of sexual shame. And second, that the loss of such sexual control shames not only a woman herself, but also her kin, her husband, and her own male relatives. Neither of these assumptions quite matches the practices that I've discussed today. First, although structurally women's seclusion can of course always be seen as a form of sexual control, Geniza documents themselves don't discuss seclusion in sexual terms. None of the sources that we've looked at describe mobile women as sexually loose or secluded women as sexually virtuous, even when they echo rabbinic texts that do describe wives' movements exactly in this way, like this passage from the Tosefta that we looked at earlier. In contrast to late ancient texts like this one, the only sexualized or sexually shaming language to appear in our medieval Geniza material pops up in the context that has the least to do with female chastity as this passage intends it, namely Maimonides' writings on menstrual purity, which term wives who have sex with their husbands without immersing properly, an entirely private, indeed possibly hidden act enclosed within the monogamous structure of marriage. He calls these women prostitutes. Maimonides uses this epithet to condemn what he views as these women's ritual transgressions, to be sure in the context of sex, but not their socio-sexual ones. Remarkably, neither he nor most Geniza documents use terms like this to describe women's sexual behavior more generally, but rather tend to discuss even cases of adultery neutrally and pragmatically. So overtly sexual honor is not a major theme in this corpus. Second, Geniza documents likewise don't describe women's movements or other sexual or gendered presentation as especially important to their own male relatives, their brothers or sons, or for that matter, fathers. What about husbands, though? Here things are a bit different. The one part of this passage that does seem to me to resonate with the Geniza evidence is the idea that a woman's loss of shame may implicate her husband's manliness. So its loss always implicates the honor of the men of the family, reflecting on the manliness of the husband, or to put it a different way, his masculine honor. These words do, I think, fit some of the material I've discussed today, but not precisely in the sense that this passage implies. Which brings me to my final point. In my view, honor and shame do in fact matter to this story, but in the context of the Geniza, they also bear rethinking. In closing, I'd like to suggest that Geniza Jews did hold heavily gendered ideas about honor, shame, kinship, and marriage, different from those assumed by the classical honor and shame model, which is sexual, but that are ultimately relevant to women's seclusion. Since these ideas were gendered, I'll address first men's honor and then women's. On the one hand, male honor is discussed throughout the Geniza from many angles, as inhering in men's wealth, social networks, public reputation within these social networks, support and care for the relatives who depended on them, especially their mothers and daughter, and occasionally their authority over their wives. Many of these ideas about male honor were related in ways that I've explored preliminarily in my forthcoming book. There I argue that divorce was common among Geniza Jews. Even within marriage, married couples often lived apart some or much of the time. both husbands and wives tended to maintain stronger social ties with their own birth relatives than with each other. Marriage was consequently as much a public arrangement whose ongoing negotiation affected a broad web of relationships within and across each spouse's own family and social networks as it was a private, effective one. In this context, some Geniza documents suggest that a man's control of his wife could magnify his public honor by signaling the honor that she herself and often her relatives accorded him, and conversely, that she could shame him by refusing such control. For example, let's look again at the contract I began with. It accuses the wife of having shamed her husband, not, it seems, sexually, but rather by mocking him, his relatives, and his financial capacity to support her. As atonement for shaming him in this way, she promises to stop doing these things and to performatively subjugate herself to him. She'll honor and serve him, stand before him when he enters and leaves, perform household tasks without complaint, refer to him and his relatives using honorifics, and finally, allow him control of her movements. Rather than a means to keep her chaste, this document and others like it portray a husband's control of his wife's movements as denoting her social submission to him and thus signaling his honor within the marriage. Honor that was certainly gendered, but not primarily or at least overtly about sex. What about women's own honor? Geniza documents address this too, although less often and in a more limited range of contexts, which consistently pertain not to women's sexuality, but to their economic security. In his work on poverty and charity in medieval Egypt, Mark Cohn has demonstrated that expressions of honor and shame loom large in charity petitions preserved in the Geniza, sent both by men and by women. These petitions describe self-sufficient, economically secure individuals as protected, mastur or mastura, a term that also means veiled, whereas they describe the act of asking for private charity, and all the more so public charity, as shameful, using the expression uncovering one's face. In charity petitions, these expressions are gender neutral. They appear equally for men and for women. But in my forthcoming book, I argue that many Geniza documents emphasize women's economic security in particular as important to their personal honor and also to their relatives' honor, in part because women remain socially connected to and often dependent on these relatives throughout their lives. This idea of women's economic honor surfaces in marriage negotiations too. For example, the husband brief promises to his wife at the end of this contract emphasize that he will honor her, value her, and support her as much as he can afford to. So just in this very brief citation, her honor is tied to the support that he offers her. Other texts tie the wife's dower, the sum at the heart of the rabbinic divorce model that I discussed throughout the talk, and hence at the heart of Geniza marriage contracts, to her and her relatives' honor. For example, a query sent to Maimonides describes a man who quarreled with his wife's relatives. So it begins, a man married a woman in Alexandria and wrote in her marriage contract that he would give her a deferred dower of 100 Egyptian dinars. She was a daughter of the elite of Alexandria. She bore him a son, and when he was almost 3 months old, her husband fought with her relatives and took an oath before witnesses that he would divorce her unless she deducted 30 dinars from her deferred dower, intending thereby to triumph over her relatives. When her relatives heard about this, they were furious. How could he decrease her deferred dower when she had done nothing wrong? They viewed this as a great disgrace and prevented her from agreeing. Within marital households, some documents connect a wife's honor to her access to a personal slave, and sometimes also a room of her own, not shared by other women in the household. Both signs of wealth that also structurally facilitate women's seclusion. So for example, this is a draft of a premarital agreement from early 12th century Fustat, in which the husband promises to honor his wife, to provide her with a female slave to serve her, and, should she ask for it, with a private living space, as it notes, is appropriate for her. In my view, the link that some Geniza documents and other medieval Islamicate texts make between strict seclusion and women's honor or elite status, which I discussed in the third of my cases, is best understood against the backdrop of these ideas about economic honor and shame. The practice of seclusion, which pragmatically speaking could be maintained long-term only by women wealthy enough to own a female slave who could mediate for them with the outside world, or socially well-positioned enough to command the loyalties of men or lower status women who were willing to do so, inherently marked a woman as fully veiled or protected in an economic sense, again, not only or perhaps even primarily a sexual one. What remains to be seen, and what I'm hoping to explore in further research, is thus not only a better sense of other components of women's domestic and economic honor within and beyond households, but also how seclusion itself worked financially, how it shaped women's property rights, their commercial activities, and ultimately the range of social contacts that they had with people outside their households, even if they rarely or never left them.